In the previous lecture, we talked about the allomorphs, and we've said that the allomorph is the phonemic form of a morpheme, and each morpheme has at least one allomorph. But there are morphemes that have more than one allomorph. Today's lecture is about these morphemes which have more than one allomorph, and we are going to talk about the reasons why we use one of these allomorphs and we cannot use the other. We've said that the allomorphs are in complementary distribution. It means that we cannot put one in the position of the other. So why? In fact, we have two reasons. Either we have phonological conditioning or morphological conditioning that determines the use of one allomorph instead of the other. We start with phonological conditioning. From its name, phonological, it is related to phonology, to sounds. When a specific morpheme has more than one allomorph, and the selection of each one of these allomorphs depends on the preceding or the following sound, it means that this selection is phonologically conditioned. So, if we have a morpheme that has more than one allomorph, and when we want to choose one of these allomorphs, we depend on the following or the preceding sound, it means that we have a phonological conditioning because we depend on sounds to select the allomorph. The first example of phonologically conditioned allomorphs is with the allomorphs of the S plural. The S plural morpheme has three allomorphs, three phonemic forms, three allomorphs, which are se, ze, and is. These allomorphs are selected according to the preceding sound, to the sound that comes before the S plural, to the sound that ends the noun. So, if the noun ends in voiceless consonants except se, she, and che, the S plural is pronounced as se. Cats, books, roofs. Notice that in cats, books, and roofs, each one of these nouns end in a voiceless consonant, but it is not se or she or che. So here the allomorph is se. We select se because we have voiceless consonants. This selection is phonologically conditioned because we depended on the preceding sound, on the sound that comes before the S plural, and that is why we say that this allomorph of the S plural is se in these words. If the noun ends in a voiced sound, except ze, je, and je. If nouns end in voiced sounds, whether vowels or consonants, except these three voiced sounds, voiced consonants, then we have to choose the ze allomorph. So, dogs, rooms, toys. Because the preceding sound is ge, the preceding sound is me, the preceding sound is a vowel in toy, the S plural here is ze, is pronounced as ze. So we select the ze allomorph in these words because we depended on the preceding sound, and the preceding sound is a voiced sound in each word. That is why we have to choose the ze allomorph. So it is phonologically conditioned. When the noun ends in se, she, che, ze, je, and je, in this case, the S plural morpheme is pronounced as is. So we choose the allamorph is when we have nouns that end with these sounds, with these 6 sounds. Branches, dishes, buses, fridges. So notice, in all of these words, the S plural is pronounced as is. So we have the is allamorph. So in these 3 allamorphs of the S plural morpheme, we depend on the preceding sound, the sound that ends the noun. That is why we say that the selection of each one of these allamorphs of the S plural morpheme is phonologically conditioned because we depended on the preceding sound. Another example of the allamorphs that are phonologically conditioned is with the allamorphs of the ed past or ed past participle. This ed has 3 allamorphs, 3 different allamorphs, te, de, or id. Each one of them is selected according to the preceding sound. The ed is pronounced as te only when the verb ends with a voiceless consonant except te. Only in this case, the ed is pronounced as te. So this allamorph is used only when the verb ends in a voiceless consonant except te. But if the verb ends in a voiced sound other than de, except de, in this case, we select the second allamorph, which is de. But if the verb ends in te or de, then the third allamorph is selected, which is id. The ed is pronounced as id. Notice that each one of these allamorphs, te, de, or id, should be pronounced according to the preceding sound. The selection of these allamorphs is conditioned, is restricted by the preceding sound. That is why we say that they are phonologically conditioned. This selection of each one of these allamorphs is phonologically conditioned because we depend on the preceding sound. Now we come to morphological conditioning. With morphological conditioning, we are concerned about morphemes. We are not concerned about sounds or phonology. Here we are concerned about morphemes. So morphological conditioning means that the selection of the allamorphs of a specific morpheme is determined by identifying specific morphemes. It means that specific morphemes require the use of a specific allamorph. A specific morpheme requires the use of a specific allamorph. So it is all about morphemes, not about sounds or phonology in this type of conditioning. An example of the allamorphs that are morphologically conditioned includes the allamorphs of the S plural morpheme. We know that the S plural morpheme has 3 allamorphs which are phonologically conditioned. They are se, ze, and is. But this morpheme also has allamorphs which are not phonologically conditioned. They are morphologically conditioned. Let's see some of them. Ox, oxen. Ox is the singular form, but oxen is the plural form. And because oxen is plural, it means that we have S plural in this word. the S plural here comes as en, and it is called en plural. And this en plural comes in 3 words in English only: oxen, children, and brethren. We have 3 words only that have en plural. Now, en plural is one of the allomorphs of the S plural. This allomorph is selected here with oxen, is used here with oxen because of the word ox itself. That is why we say that it is morphologically conditioned. Because of ox, we have oxen. So the selection of this allomorph is determined by identifying this specific morpheme. It does not depend on the following or the preceding sound. It depends on the morpheme itself. Ox requires the use of en plural, not any other allomorph. Just en plural. That is why we have to select en depending on morphological conditioning. Another example is the word child that becomes children when it is plural. Notice that here also we have en plural allomorph, one of the allomorphs of the S plural. Why do we use the en allomorph in this word? Is it because of a certain sound, the preceding or the following sound? No. It is because of the morpheme child that requires the use of the en plural allomorph. So because of the specific morpheme child, we have to use the en plural allomorph to become children. The next example is sheep, sheep. The singular form is the same as the plural form. There is no suffix or infix in this word. That is why we call this type of plurality as the zero plural. The zero plural, which has a specific symbol written between 2 brackets, is one of the allomorphs of the S plural morpheme. It is one of the allomorphs of the S plural morpheme. The question is, why do we have zero plural in the word sheep? And the answer is that the specific morpheme sheep requires the use of the zero plural allomorph. Because we have sheep, we should have zero plural allomorph. This word, this morpheme, requires the use of this allomorph. That's it. With the next word, deer, and deer again the same. We have zero plural allomorph. So why do we have the zero plural allomorph in deer, in the plural form of deer? It is because the specific morpheme deer requires the use of the zero plural allomorph in this word, which means that the selection of the zero plural allomorph is morphologically conditioned because this selection depends on the specific morpheme, on identifying a specific morpheme. In the case of sheep, it is sheep, and in the case of deer, it is deer, and we have some other words mentioned in the book. Another example is foot, feet. Feet is the plural of foot. And in feet, we have the S plural that comes in the form of an infix. This infix is going to be called a replacive allomorph because we have a replacement of one sound with another. U with E, foot, feet. Now, this replacive allomorph in feet is chosen, is selected because the specific morpheme foot requires the use of this replacive allomorph. So the selection of the replacive allomorph is determined by the specific morpheme foot. It is not determined by a preceding or a following sound. It is because of having foot, we should have feet. So the specific morpheme foot itself requires the use of this type of plurality with a replacive allomorph as one of the allomorphs of the S plural morpheme. That is why the selection of this allomorph, the replacive allomorph, is morphologically conditioned because the specific morpheme foot requires the use of this specific allomorph, the replacive allomorph. So we can say that these allomorphs of the S plural morpheme, which are the EN plural allomorph, the zero plural allomorph, and the replacive allomorph, are morphologically conditioned. The selection of each one of them is morphologically conditioned because it is determined by identifying a specific morpheme. Because specific morphemes determine the use of a specific allomorph. It is not the preceding or the following sound that determines the use of the allomorph. It is the morpheme itself that determines the use of one allomorph rather than another. As we've said earlier, the allomorphs of one morpheme are always in complementary distribution. We cannot use one in the position where the other should be used. The allomorphs of the S plural, the EN plural allomorph, zero plural allomorph, and the replacive allomorph, which are all morphologically conditioned, in addition to the se, ze, and is, which are phonologically conditioned, cannot be replaced by each other. They are in complementary distribution. We cannot use one in the position where the other should be used. They cannot overlap positions. For example, we cannot say sheeps to make sheep plural because we have to use the zero allomorph with this word. And we cannot say oxes to use the is allomorph because we have to use the en plural. That is why these allomorphs are in complementary distribution. We cannot use one in the position of each other. An example of a morpheme that has both phonologically conditioned and morphologically conditioned allomorphs is the S plural morpheme. It has three allomorphs which are phonologically conditioned. They are se, ze, and is. The selection of each one of these allomorphs depends on the preceding sound. That is why they are phonologically conditioned. But the en plural allomorph, the zero plural allomorph, and the replacive allomorph are morphologically conditioned because the selection of each one of them depends on identifying a specific morpheme. So the S plural morpheme has both types of conditioning, the phonological and morphological conditioning in the selection of its allomorphs.